Welcome to UCU, Umoja Caribbean Union, African Heritage Study Group. And this is our second Wednesday, so we are on. That's right. In our continuation of reading Marcy Moorhead's book, Crucian Dialogues, Defining the Problem. So this book can be found on Amazon. It's a huge book, but it's worth it, okay? It's worth getting it. So we have been reading on Wednesdays, not the first Wednesdays, and we are in the, not this section, I wish it was over here, but we are reading from me and she. So you can go ahead, get your book. And if you want to share in the reading, definitely inbox us, let us know so that we could coordinate in having you on with us virtually. Or if you are in Synchro and you want to be present, we could also arrange for you to be here. Yeah, she and me. So we are reading from page 162.
162 or 164?
I have 162. Does this seem familiar?
Mm,
Um,
yeah, 164.
okay, so we're turning to page 164. I'll begin with as reading she. Tell me, what did they? Oh, and sorry, we will read for 30 minutes and then go into reasoning session afterwards, okay? Yeah, forgot to make mention of that. So let me just set the timer. Otherwise, we will be reading all night till morning
And
come.
then look into reason.
Okay, so 30 minutes. All right. Okay. Why not? Tell me, what did they do to my sisters? Please don't. They didn't, did they?
Let me explain a Scandinavian tradition you don't seem to be aware of. They had a peculiar view of the female sex. A Dane, until modern times, could not accept that woman would commit capital crimes. If a woman was proven to have perpetrated a heinous act, the Scandinavian conclusion was that something had to be, something had to have possessed that female, and that would have become possessed by some evil spirit.
What are you saying? They didn't kill women?
Sort of, because in, they believe women incapable of criminal acts that would warrant execution. The law actually forbid the execution of women.
Now I'm hearing everything. I know they didn't kill Queen Mary. They took her to Copenhagen so the royal family could get to see what specimen of humanity she might be. I thought for sure the other queens were killed after being captured.
Yes, they were executed. I'm only trying to make clear how they were executed and why.
Now you have my pulse quickening again. I can't imagine what I'm going to hear now.
Just that since women could not be executed under Danish law, 14 women were declared witches and therefore subject to burning at the stake.
Oh my God, I can't believe this. Were they burned at the stake?
The Danes selected a state grove place for the spectacle, and they required the presence of the contract laborers from the surrounding estates. 14 whipping posts, size 3 trunks of the size 3 trunks had been planted in the village square, which of course would have caused the arriving audience to anticipate a public whipping. The 14 women were brought hogtied, stark naked, in an ox drawn bagoon, tied and thrusted to the tree trunks, facing outwards. Pail of molasses then appeared, and each condemned woman had the thick brown substance poured over their heads.
No, no, not, don't tell me they did that. Oh, dear God, how could people be so cruel?
It was a public execution like no other on the island. A pile of bagasse was stacked up against the condemned woman as a surreal silence gripped the stunned spectators. A flaming torch was used to ignite the pitch dry cane pox at the feet of the women. It was a horrific spectacle that must have registered as an out of body nightmare. Can you even imagine such an event without a human voice?
What do you mean?
Lady, I am telling you, those 14 women were all consumed by the flames without uttering a cry. Can you imagine something like that? I know I had never heard of anything like that before and still haven't heard of its equal. One individual silently accepting the cruel death I've heard, but 14 at the same time? Never.
But aren't you saying the assembled Crucians were silent too?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. And that's what makes it scary. I just can't get my mind around such an event.
Don't look at me. I'm speechless and my eyes are full of tears. I just feel to cry. I don't have anything else to say.
It's really interesting how similar your reaction is to that of your ancestors. A generation will pass before a Crucian would so much as speak about the fire burn. Of those 14 women in Estate Grove Place became a territorial secret. Would you consider that to be a normal reaction? Why not share your insight as to how a public event was so quickly hushed?
Why me? Can't you see I'm all teared up here?
Well, you're going to have to brace your back and band your belly because we're only getting to the nitty gritty of how controlling our consciousness up now. It would be a tacit admission of the very point I'm making. You've already clearly demonstrated that the message the Danes delivered had the same effect on you as your fellow Crucians. Your conscience has made the decision to leave that information where it's logged in your consciousness and never use a keyboard or mouse to access it.
I'll submit. You've got a point. Tell you the truth, I am so dumbfounded right now. I feel a little disoriented. Tell me, what happened to Queen Mary's children?
To the best of my knowledge, their grandmother raised them. The last information I knew of was the record of her son in police court for a petty infraction, but that would have been before the Americans took over.
So much misery and the bitter and abominable reward our people received every time they showed their humanity. That's really what's tearing at me right now. How inhumanely white people treated us. I mean, you explained that part. Why did they have to be so extreme with their punishment? It really was like they thought us to be beasts of burden. My God, they were, in fact, the ones in control. Why was it necessary to use a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito?
Mhm.
I calculated that it was 119 years from the William Davis incident to the fire burn. Doesn't that make it two major incidents in more than 100 years? than a century, and now the fire burned. If that doesn't translate to control and domination, I don't know what would. It was really like we were mules for true and not mulattoes. What else could they have thought after 119 years? Only a goddamn mule would take the harness day in and day out without a complaint. And even a damn mule would act up sometimes. What kind of subhuman
You'll never be at peace then because there is nothing more to understand about psyche than you already know. There's no way around it. It's one more bitter pill to swallow. The white man doesn't accept us as his equal. Reams and reams of documentation are in existence for your inspection.
But that was then. White people know used to. That's the change that I don't see how you're going to adjust your theory to.
I'm assuring you that no adjustments will be necessary. You keep thinking that because the whip and shackles are gone, it represents some major shifts in consciousness. And no, they don't burn women at the stake anymore. But just like there's more than one way to skin a cat, they are in fact
And that's the reason why I reacted like the typical Prujan.
I'm not so much focused on what the reaction was, but rather the fact that you and your ancestors reacted similarly to the same message.
And I suppose you're going to show me the significance of it.
That's my intention. But I don't suppose you've ever heard of a black man being held as the most dangerous prisoner in New York State.
No, I've never heard of anybody like that.
His name is Willie Bosquet. How he developed is memorialized in a well documented book by Fox Butterfield entitled All God's Children. I would strongly recommend it to you. It's about 15 years old, but as relevant as anything available today. The reason I'm referring Willie Bosquet to you is because his life is a classic case of an almost linear stream of consciousness from Edgefield, South Carolina to Augusta, Georgia, then New York City, where Willie was born. Four generations of Bosquets raised under circumstances and upbringing that would cause Willie to not only that he had to grow up without a conscience. Like his father, he was incarcerated at the age of 9. Since then, he spent very little time outside of institutions. He remained in a specially cell, constructed cell. It says construed here. Constructed,
Constructed.
yeah, constructed cell, where New York State authorities
And so, this Willie's life story is supposed to prove that the Prussian consciousness of the history you've been giving me is alive and well in our consciousness today.
It's just an example that came to mind as relevant to the issue. And that being that there is any number of documented case histories like Willie Bosquet that lay out the fact, underpinning circumstances and upbringing as the two factors responsible for our consciousness. That it's not something we're both with that predisposes us to think one way or the other. It is scientifically proven that our behavior is learned, and we learn two ways.
I'm not fooled. What you're saying is that people's behavior can be controlled by their environment. Your point is that as African descendants, we were in essence created by the white man controlling our environment.
But most critically, that while force, violence, and brutality was initially the strategy, it definitely wasn't and still isn't the only way to control our environment. If the Willie Bosquet case demonstrates my point, it's because it clearly shows how a warped personality can be developed in different locations, from slavery in South Carolina to segregation in Georgia to modern ghetto life in New York City. The pattern that led to the creation of Willie Bosquet's consciousness remained consistent throughout the generation that started with his great grandfather. So don't think that what traveled through time from slavery in the South to the ghettos in the North can't happen here.
What I'm hearing you say is that the system itself becomes more sophisticated in its strategies with the passing of time, but the message delivered to our consciousness remains the same. That's one profound statement you're making, even though it's still only rhetoric. I'll concede you've set a strong foundation for your argument. We still have to see how this plays real experience, but you say you're confident you'll be able to demonstrate all of this. It's quite a challenge, but then I didn't think you could convince me of some of the things you already have.
I'll take that to mean so far, so good. Has it ever occurred to you that your conscience could be biased?
If I'm going to be honest, I first have to admit I never thought of conscience the way you do. I really never thought of what part of me made me biased, but I will admit to having my share of them.
When you acknowledge that conscience is your moral sense, your source of what is right and wrong, you're accepting it as the foundation of your biases. So I remind you that conscience gets all its information from our consciousness. Consciousness is the computer program holding all the information. Conscience is the keyboard and mouse that decide on how it wants to access the information available to it. And if, as in the case of Willie Basket, the information stored in consciousness is void of love, nurturing, and caring, where can the conscience find anything like compassion to draw on? If no such information exists in consciousness, it becomes impossible for conscience to retrieve what's not there.
Maybe you have an aren't you sort of
Extrapolating.
extrapolating from one individual to a whole society? Why does this one case have to be the template for how and consciousness function?
Mhm.
You use this Willie case effectively, but to me it seems like a rather extreme case.
Mhm.
It's not the kind of case you hear of frequently. Maybe not even every generation might have such an extreme case, but to me it serves us as anything more than the example of how warped a psyche can get if the most imperfect of circumstances and upbringing were present. And I can see that. You made a convincing case with your explanation. However, as objective and scientific as you had been, it nearly seems out of character for you.
My apologies if I made too much of it. I am citing scientific journals upholding the objective studies on the matter. It's not hardly about Willie Basket. It's about the message of controlled being delivered despite the change in circumstances and upbringing. The message can obviously be adapted to fit the changed environment. So I took the opportunity to highlight the critical critical role within a state of mind. If the information in consciousness is sufficiently adverse and negative, it will cause a bias to develop in the conscience. And since conscious controls the information stored in consciousness, the result is a consciousness held hostage by whatever that bias might be.
Wait a minute. Aren't you talking about check and balance again?
You're a fast learner for true. The relation between conscious and consciousness is natural check and balance.
Well, then, I think I understand what you're saying. The bias you're referring to is when this naturally checked and balanced relation gets out of whack. A person's consciousness might be storing more bad experiences than good, so much so that it causes that person's conscience to have a distorted perspective of right and wrong, good and evil. When this happens, you're saying that conscience is likely to develop a bias. And because of this bias, that person's conscience is only going to access information consistent with the bias.
You're absolutely right. The normal mind would have a healthy unity of opposites, perfectly checked and balanced between conscious and consciousness. What I've been trying to explain is how a preponderance of mistreatment, deprivation, and cruel suffering in a person's life experience can cause a bias to develop.
Even the Willie story is making more sense now. Good experiences making up the information in his consciousness. And that in turn caused his conscience to malfunction. And this malfunction or bias could become so severe that it would cause even Willie Basket to describe himself as not having a conscience.
You're right on point. But again, let's not lose focus. The essence of the issue is that conscience is our moral compass. It's the sense we use to weigh our considerations of what is right or wrong, what's acceptable and what's not, and ultimately what's good or bad. Take the incident of that 1866 fire in Boss End. Wasn't it the conscience of the Prussians that determined they would not help to put out the fire? How about those who took the opportunity to loot? Where would that morality?
Talk about being on point. That is a perfect example of the application of this whole theory you're explaining. So, really, the circumstances and upbringing they created are causing Prussians to consider resistance and rebellion the right thing to do, right things to do. And conversely, any action or behavior supportive of the system is bad. It really makes sense. Consciousness is truly the engine of the mind. And what a seriously powerful engine it is. Let me give you. Understanding that concept gives me a completely different outlook. Our consciousness comes from our circumstances and upbringing, and our consciousness requires a conscience to operate it. Hmm. The relation between them is checked and balanced.
Mhm.
However, the content of the information in consciousness could be of such an extreme nature that it caused the conscience to
Mm.
malfunction to accommodate the extreme. And it's this malfunction or bias, as you call it, that distorts the moral compass of the individual.
That's really excellent. Just remember when we speak of the extreme nature of the information and consciousness, we don't want to leave the impression that distortion only happens with one kind of information, bad or good. Too much of either is extreme. Moderation is always the key to healthy information. It just so happens, of course, that our issue deals with extremely adverse information. It's the story of our lives. Therefore, understanding the role of consciousness We would expect Crucians to have a distorted sense of reality when compared to that of our conquerors. And unfortunately, those are the very people we compare ourselves to. We don't admit it publicly, even to ourselves, but our individual consciences are as different as theirs as night and day. Yet, isn't it our conscience that we use in the upbringing of our children? In other words, isn't it our very conscience that makes the determination as to what's right and wrong we pass to the next generation?
Absolutely, Mister. You set the trap and I walked right into it. So, is the conscience the means for passing on our inferiority and everything else bad for us? And it's been right in front of me all the time.
Yes, but you have been using yours to pretty effectively fend me off for the longest while. But the more I talk to you, I realize you were too intelligent. It took me this long to find the right way to explain myself. And then, too, it's not the subject matter you hear discussed on a regular basis. I must have sounded really weird when I first tried to explain the theory.
Weird is not the word, but I won't go there. Suffice it to say that a few times early on, I really thought of walking over there to the police station to report you. But you kept hitting those chords in me. I tell you, it's been quite a roller coaster up and down. Now that you got me, I want to hear it. Give me your best shot.
I just want to finish what I started. I really think I can help you to understand what your son needs.
As I said, you got me. Just go on with it.
I will if I could only be certain that you understand the consequences. If the conscience of our Crucian ancestors was so distorted that it developed a bias against our own particular race,
The inferiority, I think I understood that.
just as long as you accept it as a mental condition as opposed to a symptom of inferiority.
I'll go along as I'm sure you'll make it all clear in time.
All right. So Joe Paris is dead, slaughtered in Anna's Hope cane field. Queen Mary is in Copenhagen, Denmark, being guacked at like a Hottentot Venus from southern Africa. Gratefully, laborers also died with the fire burn. Laborers got their pay doubled to 10 cents a day with only rent deducted. And a pass was no longer required to go off the plantation. But corporal punishment on the estates would continue for generations yet. The overseer's power might have been curtailed but not terminated yet. Most interestingly, the heavy veil of silence about recent events continued. 49 sugar estates had been burned to the ground. 15 livestock estates had gone up in smoke, and West End town was mainly a charred ruin. Hundreds of prisoners overflowed the cells in the fort. A dozen men had been shot to death against the fort wall. Hundreds gunned down in the cane fields, and 14 women burned at the stake in a spectacle. Not a word of any of this would come from the lips of Crucian. It was as it never happened. Not until the modern era would the events of October 1878 receive any public scrutiny on this island.
Did
That's a
they
fail.
just internalize it? Could they? Could they really just swallow all of that? No, no way. That would have been too much. I really don't see how any human being could have just absorbed all of that kind of trauma and not let it out. There would have had to be some kind of release if they weren't going to talk about it. They should have exploded. At least I would have. Haven't you ever heard the saying of ours, pressure does bust pipe?
Yes, I've heard it. But I've also heard the one that says, shut your door and lick your child. I'll agree that it must certainly seem humanly impossible, but as best as I have been able to ascertain, there's no evidence. Like you questioned, I'll have to say yes, they swallowed it. They must have just swallowed all that traumatic misery and drowned themselves in work because work there was and plenty of it. Almost half of the island had to be rebuilt, and whether they talked about it or not, the overseers were determined to have the Crucians reconstruct as fast as they destroyed. The pace and hours they would be driven were bound to make cane cutting at harvest time seem like exercise in comparison.
21st century consciousness, but I don't believe I could have done something like that. My conscience would have turned into your Willie of the example. I mean, I really could see myself as a psychopath
Mhm.
wreaking havoc on every white person I could find. So tell me, what would have happened in their consciousness to bring about all that silence?
I imagine you'd need some kind of a psychoanalyst to answer that question. I still don't have a solid clue, only speculation.
But wouldn't the whole experience have been the kind of overload that could adversely affect the conscience?
I certainly would think so, but without some concrete evidence, we're back to speculating. So, yes, I agree. It most definitely was the kind of experience that could warp consciousness. But unless I include the occasional individual who went berserk and had to be killed like a wild animal as such a victim, what's left? And the truth of the matter is that almost from the beginning, just like there'd be runaways, there'd also be those, male or female, who just simply lost it. Snap. And of course, condition. If the overseer couldn't control you, depending on his disposition, you're either killed or tied up.
Mm, I see your point. Without any evidence to indicate what they did other than work, we can only guess at how their consciousness handled all that trauma. And unless they literally swallowed all that, it had to be somewhere. Doesn't that mean it had to be stuck in them? Doesn't it? So the conscience had to be affected in turn, meaning that unless all of this is wrong, whether it was objectified or not, the Crucian conscience had to be such that they would think it morally right to do something. And I guess you'll respond that they would if they could, because as you've indicated, conditions provided little opportunity.
And don't forget the changed circumstances and upbringing in your criticism. Contract labor Contract labor was over. Freedom of movement at night, if there was any energy left, was now part of the social fabric. So the question was the more reasoned one of how to improve condition. Even the primitive free market condition developing around Crucian would necessarily have given them pause. Slavery was now over, both in law and in practice. The victory had finally come to the island.
I didn't look at it that way. And I guess this perspective even provides kind of a reason for their silence. To them, it must have been a confusing new world just to get as much as 25 cents at the end of a week, but then fend for yourself. Again, it would have been a life experience I can't imagine. A conscience telling you to resist against it all, while the hard reality beckons you to master the newly gained opportunities. It's like there's never been a time when Crucians could let down their guard. This one, especially considering the whole rebuilding effort couldn't have been any less miserable than contract labor. I remember seeing pictures of our people before the Americans of us in rags. Wait, to tell you the truth, I remember images of Crucians after World War II, and we were still in rags and barefoot. Just listen to me. What am I doing telling your story? Let me stop.
You were doing good. I agree with everything you were saying. However, I think it might add some value to our perspective if I point out that contract labor was marked by a noticeable rise in spirituality. And I'm not just referring to denominations or
Listen.
evangelism.
I know you're talking about Obia, right?
Maybe you could tie it to the freedom of movement, but without question, there was a marked spike in the Jumbi and werewolf stories circulating among Crucians. Certainly, Danes became known werewolves among the local populations. Crucians would actually point out how a certain white man moved or walked and swear that was because the man could turn into a huge white dog at night. And as if those cane field laborers wouldn't have been tired enough after working all day, stories of Jumbi running people on the road.
Would you attribute those to their overloaded consciousness?
If you ask me, I would say those would be indications of a busy subconscious. Don't ask me how, but I would consider the spiritual apparitions and the stories of them to be some kind of check and balance compromise between conscience and consciousness to subconsciously generate an escape valve.
Mhm.
It was sought as a vessel to contain some of the overload.
If we accept that they use superstitions, obia, jumbis, werewolves, and so on to relieve the pressure of their overload, their consciousness, would that have sustained them?
It had to. The proof of the pudding would be the generation they produce. Any historian would have to admit that it was the children of the fireburn generation who made up the first influential class in our history. As a matter of fact, I'll categorically state that the greatest Crucians we've produced so far were born in the period I would extend from the fire burn to the American takeover from 1878 to 1917. More Crucians of vision were born than at any other time.
What a paradox. Obia and intellect develop along parallel lines. And this would have been our state of mind as we approach the 20th century. Thank our upbringing was getting a much needed dose of social revolutionary vision because I just know one of those intellects you're referring to has to be the one and only David Hamilton Jackson. Not so,
Mhm.
Wheel Ben
And story
and
and
Story End for tonight.
wow,
So we will
wow.
continue
And
on
172.
page 172.
Yes, sir.
What a story to tell the king or the queen.
Wow. Back to this whole thing. We've been hearing about consciousness for the past few days and how consciousness can be influenced by
Mm-hmm.
external events, by what's taking place in the environment, and understanding that your brain is like a computer, right? And just like a computer, you have the hardware, you have the operating system, you have the programming, right? And then you have what it is you're trying to control, right? Now, interesting to see how in this book Mario broke it down as the checks and balances of conscience and consciousness. And he equated the conscience like the keyboard and the mouse, right? And the consciousness as the stored information to be accessed. So
Mm-hmm.
when we come to the atrocities, look at the atrocities that took place. And nobody talked about it.
It was too traumatic.
Nobody talked about it. They just pushed ahead. They became ignorant. They became ignorant because imagine witnessing that and going through that experience and knowing you have all this nothing.
Interesting. It
All
was
you could do is bury it. Go ahead.
so it was interesting with that example and another example where it was like good versus evil.
Evil, right?
So it's like our Crucians, the Crucians saw evil taking place, and
Could not do nothing about it.
they could have, but if they did, they may have not. Don't react, because if you react, then you could be the next one that's going to be punished. So they had to take that in for so long, hide that fear,
Mm-hmm.
or well, hide that anger, hide that this is so unjust for these people to be treating human beings like that. But I'm just gonna swallow it because if I do anything, then I'm going to get punished. Apply this to today, of course. You always have to reflect on what's going on today.
Right,
We may see wrongs taking place,
right.
right? And we choose to just stay quiet because it's not that necessarily you're going to get punished, but your liberty is going to get disturbed where
Mm-hmm.
you are in a certain class of receiving such high income and benefits, etc., that if you open your mouth to speak against the wrong that's done, well, okay, let's say punish. You lose all those benefits and your high salary. So you have to now.
Mm-hmm. Subject to termination, you know?
So that is punishment in that
Right.
regards, but you really have to now draw the line as saying, is this something I'm willing to continue for generations to come, like keeping that knowingness of that's wrong. I'm gonna just suck it in, and guess what? My cheering up pass. You see wrong happening, suck it in, okay?
On your
Don't say
face. Yeah.
nothing. Allow the wrong to continue. And then the question we may ask is like, so when is it going to end? When is the corruption going to end? Well, that says it.
Right.
It could stop now if we choose to say, hey,
Right.
no more. Or it will continue if we continue to just hush your mouth like a child, don't say nothing,
Yeah.
you know?
Go about your way, mind your business. You know, go along and get along to get along. Don't shake the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Don't rock it too much. Don't. If it quiet enough and it ain't affecting me, it all right. No matter how grotesque, how wicked, or how evil, or how uncomfortable I feel, I'll just swallow it. And we see that today in our society. People aren't saying anything. People know things that go wrong, that is wrong, and they'll just, as long as I get my paycheck, I good. As long as I continue to be able to go and go home and watch my TV, I good. As long as I could keep up my prosperity, I good. And not recognize that you're pushing yourself into a worse condition. Because had these people recognized where they were at in that moment after the fire burned and never gave up, they would have won. They would have won, right? But what happened? They allowed the fear of the grotesqueness of what was done in front of their face to say, me what happened to me?
Absolutely.
Me what happened to me and my family? You know what? Let me shut my mouth. Me ain't gonna even talk about it. Why? They raised we from 5 cents to 10 cents, and now we could go out at night. I happy with that.
You ain't here, and now you don't need a pass. It's so funny in these times for real, that we could really reflect on what's happening right now.
Because now you need a pass.
You need exactly. So it's so interesting. So it's like, wow. I mean, about people, whereas it's like they allow for ignorance,
right?
To just persist, and instead of them, like the truth or the facts could be right in front of them, but because they prefer to follow the script, and when they follow the script, they're going to receive rewards. They're going, you understand? And it's like that reward is so great, even though I know this thing is somewhere,
right?
And they're then want to insist that others go along with the script and say, so it's similar like, hush your mouth, man, just go along with the script, even though it's wrong. We know it's wrong, but go along with the script.
It ain't for we to fix. It ain't for we to fix.
But yet we gonna complain, all corruption and thing happening. Yeah. It's because we choose to.
And nobody's asserting their position, because the line of morality, as he pointed out in this book, because it was a time when they were seen wrong and couldn't do nothing against it. Couldn't do nothing, because the wrong was put in a way and the level of coercion to make you accept the wrong as right. And now we're living in a society of a major distortion, a society, the whole fabric is built on lies. And even now, drawing a comparison today, when they talk E19 crap, right? And they're telling you that, natural immunity is no good. Imagine they're telling you natural immunity is no good. Is no good. That you have to take a foreign substance outside of you to put into your body to enhance your body's capability so that you could fend off whatever is transhumanism.
And you know what? I'm so glad that this, where we saw control, where he mentioned about control, right? And in something we were recently reasoning about, right? So in that sense of putting artificial, synthetic things into our natural body, it's a form of control.
Right.
Because then
ownership.
Natural body or the body they want to control.
And not choose, because you don't have a choice. You're being coerced.
We don't have a choice.
You're being no, hear me out, because you always have a choice. But I'm saying in the context of how we process information, understanding the experiences we have gone through in our generations, right? We think that the choice is, right, that we have no choice if we don't do these things.
Ah.
So that's what I'm trying to say. So they're using coercion, right? They're using manipulation, right? And they're using intimidation, right? To try to get people to accept this situation as normal, and they totally discount, right, what your own capability is. And it's a either you take this and go along with your life, or you don't get to eat. Same situation, same type of scenario.
Right.
Suck it up and don't talk about it.
Right.
Leave it alone. Everything else outside of what we tell you is misinformation.
Right. So we're feeding you. We're providing these benefits to you.
Mhm.
And that's all that you need to accept. Okay, we'll take care of you. Hey, I can build up my immune system. I could go and exercise. I could go and take a good soak in the water. I could go and spend some time out in the sun. I could, things like that are natural.
None of
It's
that
like,
matters.
no, yeah, those things don't matter. Don't worry about that. We'll take care of you. So it's a part of brain. It's a part of, I won't just say brainwashing, but of sending messages that, hey, you don't need nature. We could take care of you. Forget about planting, growing your own food. Forget about that. We'll provide you with free shelter as long as you accept this. It's awakening that people need to realize that, hey, this is a different form of slavery
Mhm.
that is encroaching on us. And as was mentioned in the reading, so it's like Jet has actually worked, so to speak, like the example of Willie that was given, for
Yeah.
generations.
4 generations
For exactly. And
of distortions and pressures within the environment create a warped sense of consciousness and a bias to the point that he don't feel nothing for nobody.
mm,
This is perpetual. This is passed on genetic.
this is a serious point that he made, a serious point that you're making right now, because again, now, well, not again, but let us be said, okay, our culture, and that was a little reasoning that was shared when Mary was on
Yeah.
our youth
The
empowerment
difference
session.
between
Yeah, history versus culture, right? So is this going to be the way to do this, or the way that we should continue to live? The things in the past, it was a time in which our ancestors felt this is the crops that they were getting, from the oppressors. See, I ain't calling them slave masters, but the
they are
oppressors.
oppressors.
And it's like for generations we continue with that habit of eating certain things that's causing our people to get diabetes,
Right.
okay, high blood pressure,
Mhm.
and in our mind